that it's necessarily available and explicit for learning. It needs to be explicitly mediated. And so we were very clear to distinguish between these. And in order to mediate, we needed to construct mediating tasks. So what were the nature of the mediating tasks? And the first thing we had to do very clearly was distinguish between what was the learner task, what it was that learners would be doing, and what was the teacher task that we wanted teachers to learn from. Clearly, there's a learner task inside a teacher education task, but we needed to distinguish these and be clear about them. We also needed to make sure that if we were going to connect with teachers, that the teacher task was rooted in records of teaching and learning practices, and that it focused on a specific curricular level of mathematics and a specific concept in mathematics. This would be the way to connect with teachers. And the other thing, in order for this to be a task about teaching, that we could focus on teaching practices, we needed the maths in the tasks to be relatively easily done by teaching, that the maths itself would not become an obstacle. And I need to add that while we did tasks that were easy for teachers, it didn't mean that they didn't learn mathematics while they were doing it. And I hope I'll show some of that. In addition to those two principles about distinguishing mediating and modeling and distinguishing the learner and the teacher task, we worked very hard, and this is a clear principle of practice, to externalize teachers' spontaneous explanatory talk for collective reflection and interrogation. And this is about the context. So there are discourses about what's good teaching, what's important in the school, how the school operates. Those are working at a deep cultural level inside the school, and those will shape how teachers talk in the classroom. And it was very important that we had access to what it was that they thought were quality explanations and why, so that we could work with those, particularly if we thought there were any problems related to them. And so we worked with tasks that would externalize this. And then we also worked to develop explicit evaluative criteria for what we meant by the quality of word use and the quality of mathematical justifications in classroom talk. And in order to make that come alive a little bit, I'm going to give you an example of what we did. The task I'm choosing to share now is one, it's one of many, but it's one that illustrates these four principles most clearly. It's about producing an explanation for learners. So this was a particular task. The teacher's task is to produce an explanation, not for themselves, but for their learners. And this was the task. Your grade 9 learners say that they know that 5p and 4q are unlike terms, and they say we can add like terms, we cannot add unlike terms, but in a test, your learners will write 5p plus 4 is equal to 9p. Now, this is a very well-known problem. Conjoining teachers recognize it. We saw it in errors in their tests. And so this was the task for the teachers. How will you convince a learner who writes this that he or she is wrong? And we've had discussions about wrongness, and write down at least 2 different ways in which you will do this. And then in your group, the teachers worked, we had 50 teachers in the group. The teachers worked at 10 tables with 5 teachers at a table. They needed to collect the different ways of explaining in the group, and then decide in their group which they thought was the most convincing for grade 9 learners. We wanted to know what the teachers valued as the criteria for a good explanation. So just to go back to the principles, there's the learner task, 5p plus 4, add 5p and 4. There's the teacher task, and this is a well-known teacher problem. It's rooted in teacher practices. They see it, they recognize it, and they struggle to mediate it. The teacher problem, as I said, is about building their own explanation for a learner, not for themselves. Working in their groups, we work to externalize their spontaneous ideas about explanatory communication. And we wanted to build then and establish criteria for what is valued as a good explanation. So I'm going to share with you 4 different table responses. I'm not sure how easy they are to read. And I wanted to keep the originals and not rewrite them, because this is what we work with. The teachers developed their responses, wrote their collective responses on newsprint, and this was then displayed around the room, and teachers went and discussed all the different tables. But the thing that was important for us is that over the 3 years that we ran the course, and with many teachers, these were the top 2 were the dominant response. And for those who are knowledgeable about our research on algebra, we would call this fruit salad algebra, where the object and letter are the P is treated as an object rather than as an unknown, or in the early research, the letter is treated as an object and not as an unknown. And this has consequences coming down the line, because it doesn't really portray the meaning of the symbolic form 5p. And of course, we had other ranges of explanations ranging from partial to full. And so we were able to discuss all of these with teachers. The significance of what I want to say here is that these were so prevalent, and it was extremely interesting, the debates in class about whether these should be used with learners or not. Many of the teachers were adamant that it didn't matter if it caused problems later, because this did avoid the problem of conjoining 5p and 4q. And it didn't matter when they understood, other teachers were upset about it, but there were many teachers that were very stuck with this. And part of this had to do with a very strong discourse at the time in the country that mathematics needed to be made relevant, and it needed to be easy for learners. It was inaccessible, it was abstract, and the way to make it more accessible was to make it relevant and link with everyday life. And so teachers thought that this is what they were doing when they were doing this, and if it was fruit salad algebra, well, too bad, because it was not, it didn't manifest as a problem directly when they were doing it. In fact, it helped learners answer tests correctly. But we had very vigorous discussions, and then we would talk with them about how they used words, what were the mathematical words, and not just the vocabulary, but also ways of talking, always, if, then, this, if. In that particular example, the 5p plus 4 is 9p when p is 1. So it's only true if p is 1. And all of those are important ways of talking mathematically. And then we talk with them about the way they were talking colloquially and how they were describing something like 5p to learners, which is the 4 has no variable. 5 is the number next to the variable. That's how you distinguish whether these are different terms. And we would then talk with them about what actually is the meaning of 5p, and can you talk in other ways that would convey that meaning and still be relevant. And just to give you some idea of what we did, we would then share with them different ideas and different kinds of explanations. Most of these had come up. So many teachers did something like this. Many did this. They tried different numbers and just tried one number and said, well, it doesn't work if p is 2, so it can't be true. And we talked with them, that is valid, of course, but it's a partial explanation. It doesn't test all cases. And then something like this, which is much more general and treats p as a variable. And then we introduce something that could be in between, which is, can we think of a way that might connect more with learners, but that represents p as an unknown number? And so can you think about p as a box with a number of sweets? And maybe that would be a way that they could communicate this more easily. Okay, so why is this an illustrative task? I think I've tried to explain that. It helps show what we were trying to do and the principles we were working with. Just to give you an example of a different task, we gave them this equation, 6 minus x is equal to 6 subtract x is equal to 10. Here are the responses that learners gave. Some gave the correct response, some gave 4, some gave 16, some gave -4. How would you respond to each of these responses? How would you deal with students who have given these responses? And this is a very different kind of task, because it does create space for talking about other ways of talking about these mathematical objects and talking about an equation in words, which is very important, which is, I'm looking for a number that, if I subtract it from 6, will give me 10. If I subtract this number from 6, then I will get 10. This is the kind of discursive elaboration that you need in order to build the ways that they can talk mathematically. Can you set this in a realistic setting? We had very interesting discussions around this, and this is not really easy, possible, or desirable. But the important thing we were communicating is that it is important to talk about and make sense of symbolic forms. And we spent quite a bit of time with teachers that they needed to move away from what we saw originally was just reading out strings of symbols to talking about the symbolic forms in meaningful ways. So now I want to get to the nub of the talk and say, well, what was I trying to do here? I was trying to share with you the how of PD when we try to focus on language responsive teaching practices like word use and justification. I selected a particular PD task to illustrate this, and I used a second example to show that each of those tasks had a mathematical specificity. One was focused on variable, the notion of variable, the other on integer operations, to show that actually you have to have a very narrow focus like that if you're going to be able to do the discursive elaboration and figure out what are the important ways of talking about this key idea. I try to show you how important it was to elicit teacher productions because they are very rich resources for discussing what they afford and then what they might limit for learners becoming mathematical. And if they were limiting, then what could be some replacements? And then how we attended to word use and justification in relation to on-the-ground practices. So to conclude, I want to put this back into the context of the overall results of the project, which says we have some confidence in the salience of what we do. The teachers learned from the course, they learned from using the framework, and their learners learned. Okay. We have both qualitative and quantitative data on this. What I wanted to share here, which is what I think is a difficult issue in teacher education research, is how to communicate the how of what we do in a rigorous and scholarly way. And I hope I've been able to do that. This is not a trivial task. We do it all the time. This is what we do as teacher educators. And often we're teacher educators and researchers. It's not trivial. I've tried to show how both the content of the tasks is important and how context matters. And of course, as you do this, it raises the very important question that was raised in the panel discussion. Well, then, how does this contribute to the field? What's the generality of this? Is this peculiar to South Africa? Is it just a local importance? And I would argue very strongly that it is not. I've linked it to the literature. The literature is coming from the US, from Spain, which says we need to be visibilizing these practices and finding scholarly ways to talk about them. And I want to conclude by saying it's been a very fruitful journey for our project, and hope that the how of doing PD and language responsive practices is a research direction going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jill. Very, very interesting talk. And you related nicely to the panel discussion, previous panel discussion. We have some time for questions.
Sí, doctora, hemos habilitado el panel para todos los que nos están escuchando por si quieren hacerle alguna pregunta a la doctora Adler. Esperemos unos 2 minutos.
2 minutos.
Sí.
Okay. No veo preguntas en el chat. Preguntas.
Uy, yo pensé que había puesto la cámara.
Sí.
Sí, ya hay.
Veo, ok. Sigue. ¿Dónde están? No los veo.
Y una doctora que dice, una en inglés, pero la primera dice, esa diferencia lingüística, ¿cómo afectan a los niños migrantes?
Okay. The question, Jill, is how do, of course, within your experience and your interrelation with other people working in on the same problems. How do these different languages or linguistics affect migrant students is the question. And I don't know if it's a good question for you, but maybe you have some.
Well, it's an interesting question. So the multi-languages are not migrant languages in the sense that South Africa is a multilingual country. There are 11 official languages. There's the colonial languages, English and Afrikaans. And then there are 9 indigenous languages, and they all have official status now. But English remains the language of power, the language of commerce, the language of politics. And so it is the language of desire in many senses. This is very contested. But that said, there has been massive migration down into South Africa from other Southern African countries. And so the language issue has become more complicated. And there's other research that's going on that's dealing with migrants. We also have, if you want, migration from the rural areas into the urban areas. And the languages in the rural areas are more pure. So the vernacular languages, say in KwaZulu-Natal, the Zulu spoken there is not quite the same as the Zulu spoken in the cities. It's been mixed with all sorts of other things. And so there are multiple language problems. And that's why the motivation for translanguaging, especially in the early grades, to work with all the languages that learners bring. And it's a massive problem if the teacher doesn't speak all the languages, but these are the things that are happening on the ground. At a secondary level, it's very different because there's an external exam in grade 12, it's high status, it's all happening in English, there's controversy about whether this should stay. But the goal is to be able to do mathematics and English ultimately through the 12 years of schooling. And so at a secondary level, there's much more pressure on English. I don't know if that's answered the question.
Okay, there's another question. It's in English. It says, is this research primarily developed with teachers that are already part of the education system or also includes future teachers' education?
This research was with existing teachers. Okay, and one of the things that there wasn't time to go into everything, but many of the teachers in the current core were still experienced the impact of the deep inequalities and problems under apartheid. So many of the teachers that are still in the current core were trained in teacher training colleges. Many of them were closed after 1994. Slowly, younger and newer teachers are coming into the system, and then are better trained. They've been trained in the new universities since post-apartheid in 1994. But many teachers in the system were inadequately prepared, and those were many of the teachers that we were working with.
Okay. I will paraphrase the next question because I think it's an interesting one for you. The person is asking about explanation in everyday language concerning everyday instances in mathematics. And you said something about that already. Yes. I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more.
This is such an important
the idea of how
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
So this is really very important. And some of what we're doing now is a consequence of an attempt at curriculum revision, or not curriculum reform, deep curriculum reform, that happened between 1996 and 2005 to create an integrated curriculum that worked from problem-based learning, from problems rooted in experiences. And there were just multiple problems. And the only way to describe it quickly was to say that managing that kind of curriculum and the demands of reform practices required a knowledge and competence of teachers that was not part of the dominant teaching core for no fault of their own. And ironically then, in complete contradiction to what was intended, the new curriculum benefited the well-to-do schools and the schools in the higher economic and middle class areas, and the schools in the lower economic areas, the rural areas and the poorer areas really suffered. That's because there's still also a relatively formal curriculum, but what's happened in response to that is a much more traditionally focused curriculum. And so about what is the relationship between us and building mathematics from that in a curriculum that's driven from mathematics. And we've landed up now with a curriculum driven from mathematics. And therefore there needs to be mediation between the everyday ideas and problems that learners would be familiar with in the ways that they talk towards a scientific and disciplinary discourse of mathematics. And I know it's not what our field likes to hear. And I think particularly in Latin America, there's, from what I understand, there's still, there is an important rooting of trying to figure out how curriculum can work that starts with on-the-ground practices. All I can say is that from our experience, it was contraindicated. It did the opposite of what was intended. The intention of that kind of curriculum had very significant unintended inequitable consequences. And so it was revised and we had another reform.
Thank you, Jill. Do we have time for one more question? We do. Okay. The question is it correct to state that natural language affects the understanding of algebraic situations, or perhaps is it a problem of intuition?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's our job as teachers, and that's what we try to communicate with teachers. It's our job, it's the teacher's work to navigate between these. So no natural language is a prohibitor. There are linguistic constructions in some of our vernacular languages that work contrary to mathematics. So when you talk about an inequality relationship, you would put the bigger number first and the smaller number second. And so you get some little confusions between more and less. But there are ways that you navigate this, and there are ways that you mediate it and you work with it and you work with what the learners bring, and you are of course constrained if you yourself are not multilingual and therefore can operate between these, but that's the work that has to be done.
Okay, thank you so very much, Jill.
There's an interesting question that I want to have a comment on that I see here. Okay. I don't know if it was towards me. It's something about COVID-19. Is it possible to reproduce the research with pre-grade teachers? There's a lot of very interesting questions. But of course, what we're struggling with right now, and I'm almost retiring, so I've handed over to the person who was working with me. But I have 2 postdocs working with me, and we are working in a COVID context. We're not going to be vaccinated for some time. Mm-hmm. I won't go into the obvious reasons for that, but not only because of the particular variant here, but it's how the vaccines are spreading across the world. So we're going to live with COVID and how to deal with that. Our schools have gone back, so schools are back in process, but strictly speaking, and really the learners in the schools I'm talking about have lost a year of schooling. Okay, many of them could not be online. They could not be online satisfactorily. They were distant. In many of the homes, even if there was connectivity, there was one computer for a family of 6. Everybody was fighting for connectivity. We were able to work in some cases with learners with WhatsApp, but actually there were significant constraints. Classrooms are large, so bringing learners back in small groups meant that some kids only came to class once a week. because if there are 100 kids in class and you want 20 a day, then you've got to have 5 different programs. So we've got a very significant catch-up program at work, and I don't think we begin to know how to research this or think about it. So that's the one issue about what does it mean, and I think this is going to be the case in many countries across the world, where it's not just that that schooling might have been interrupted and gone into remote form. It's for many kids, and I would say in the elementary grades and in early learning, this has been devastating, because it's been a backward move. They've lost their reading, they've lost their number skills. And so there are significant challenges for education, and I hope we can all rise up to them. And it has consequences for mathematics learning and what are core concepts, and can you leapfrog through and you can't keep learners back because there's a next cohort coming up. They're massive, massive challenges. That's the one end, and I think there are all kinds of opportunities that teachers have taken. They've made progress despite these conditions, and we've yet to learn about what all of those are. And so there's that side of it. The other side of it is, what does it mean for doing research? So we don't have access to classrooms, and we won't have access to classrooms for some time. What does it mean to do classroom-based research? And I think that we will be constructing methodologies for this. So we want to construct a kind of a lesson study with some of our teachers, and we're having to figure out how to do this in a mixed, remote and on-site way, and in ways that won't disrupt what is already a pressure program in the schools. It's very exciting at one level, what it means to try to deal with this and build back better. How do we make things better? We have an opportunity to make things better. And how do we do it in more equitable ways? So I think it's a massive challenge for our field, and I'm excited for things that we can do.
Okay. Thank you very much for addressing that issue, Jill. We did a small survey in the Bogota public schools, and just to reinforce what you said, about 20% of the students had connectivity, and about 80% of the students did not.
Yeah. So it's to understand with that it's not just the loss of that time, there's regression.
Right.
You know, over the summer vacation, learners regress. Mm-hmm. So over an entire year, it's just dramatic. So we have to grapple with that issue and think about it from a mathematical point of view. What are key things? How, can one think about curricula in ways that will help people working in these contexts to make progress?
Correct. Okay. Well, thank you once again, Jill. Very, very interesting talk. And as you can see, you had many questions arise from the audience. Osvaldo, do you want to make any kind of an announcement?
No.
¿Se quiere hacer algún tipo de comentario acerca de los planes por la tarde?
Sí, Ángela.
Gracias, doctor Osvaldo, doctora Mari. Un agradecimiento muy especial a la conferencista, la doctora Jill Adler, a los panelistas de la jornada anterior y a todos ustedes, profesores e investigadores que continúan conectados en estos espacios de discusión académica tan enriquecedores. Queremos invitarlos a que nos acompañen a las 3 de la tarde, hora colombiana, a la presentación de los pósters. Se dará la apertura con 20 minutos de anticipación a cada una de las salas. Les recuerdo que el día de hoy, entre las 5 y las 6 de la tarde, hora colombiana, recibirán en sus correos electrónicos la agenda de actividades académicas para el día de mañana con los respectivos links de conexión. Dado que los cursillos y las conferencias paralelas empiezan mañana, les solicitamos que hagan el registro a los eventos en los que participarán a más tardar el día de hoy a las 8 de la noche, hora colombiana. De nuevo, pues muchísimas gracias a todos por estar conectados en estos espacios. Los esperamos en horas de la tarde y que tengan un buen descanso.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego, entonces.
Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.
Nos vemos en horas de la tarde.